Good morning. Welcome to SOGCast number 36. This production of SOGCast is brought to you courtesy of Jocko Willing Productions and his technical staff in conjunction with SOG Chronicles. My name is John Stryker-Meyer. I'll be your host today, and I'm joined today by Chad, our technician. Welcome, Chad. And so we want to talk today about Operation Tailwind, which was during the 8-year Secret War, was one of the most successful, if not most successful, hatchet force operations, which would be a company-sized operation outside of the area of operations during the 8-year Secret War. This occurred between September 11th and the 14th, 1970, and we'll get into more detail on that. And today we have a unique perspective from the aviator who participated in that whole 4-day operation. And on day one, when they had an insertion, several of the helicopters that were inserting the troops were shot up. And during the operation, they used CH-53 Delta models, Marine Corps couriers that took the troops, which would be 116 indigenous personnel from FOB2 at CCC Central, MACV-SOG headquarters out of Khartoum. They had 16 Green Berets that were on the ground with the team with different air assets. And because the target was so far west, the Marine Corps brought in the CH-53 Deltas, and during the insertion, gunships supported them with gun runs. And one of the gunships that was in the Marine Corps MLH 367, the call sign was Scarface. And Scarface participated quietly in the Secret War, unknown to most Americans, for almost the entire Secret War, providing air cover. And this was one of the more historic missions. And reading her, we're reading from a book called Operation Tailwind, penned by Barry Pencek. And he wrote, "My bird took 5 hits," and this is during their first insertion. Now, normally, with a recon team, if a team going in took gunfire, the mission was compromised. But for this mission, they had to get the troops on the ground, and the mission was to distract from a CIA operation as well as to look for any intel while they're on the ground. So they're inserting. At least 3 indigenous troops were wounded during the insertion, and combining that with the tactical air and our Marine Corps gunships, here Scarface, Barry wrote, "My bird took 5 hits. Joe, that's Joe Driscoll, another Scarface fellow pilot, took 10. One round went right through the tail rotor shaft, and another went through the rear instrument panel, lodged in the back of my seat. We lost all radios and electrical gear and started losing power with nothing but bad guys all around. It was kind of tense for a while. The only thing I didn't like about the mission is that the worst is yet to come." So today I welcome Barry Pencek, author of this book, Operation Tailwind. Welcome, sir.
Thank you very much, Tilt. Wonderful to be here.
Indeed. And that insertion, I mean, everything about that mission was so unique that it just is mind-boggling. Even when I read your book, when I go back through the numbers, it's well written, well documented. You spent a lot of time. How many years you spent putting all this together?
Took me 5 years to do it.
Is that right?
Yeah. I thought I could do it in 2, but not to be. It took 5.
So always the best plans of men and me's.
Exactly.
Mises, right? Yeah. So for this operation, that was for you, I mean, taking those kind of rounds, 5 hits, and then losing the electrical power. So you had no radios, but still, as I recall, you still made gun runs, and then was it you or Joe who ran out of ammo but still made one more run, because when the NVA would hear the helicopters coming, they would all disengage?
Yeah, that was Joe.
That was Joe.
Well, they took a round in the what's called the inner velometer on the back of a rocket pod, and
yeah,
shot all 19 rockets at once. And Joe's flying with Sid Baker, and Sid says, "Did you do that?" And he says, "No, I didn't do it. I thought you did it." And he said, "No, I didn't do it." And then their radios get shot out too. And,
Oh man. So so from here, I think on that first day, like you said, you knew the worst was to come, and so that was based on your experience. And again, Scarface had been participating in the Secret War for 8 years. Up to that point, this was the first 6 years of the Secret War. Scarface was there for most of it. And by now, in '68 when I arrived, we had the old UE, in your case, it would be the UH-1Es that would be underpowered. They would have weapons and bullets that they could barely get off the ground. Now you guys are flying the Cobras. And that was a unique experience because you had more of a helicopter design just to be a flying weapon platform.
Yeah, it was designed strictly as a gunship. The best part, it was air conditioned. Of course, with the Hueys, you'd let the windows roll down the windows, but you couldn't do that in a Cobra
because it
had a canopy, like a fighter. So had air conditioning. But the first Cobras were kind of underpowered. Also, we couldn't.
Is that right?
We couldn't take a full bag of gas. We'd take about 1,000 pounds. A full bag was 1,800 pounds, and sometimes on a hot day, you'd have to bounce along the runway to get airborne, But at least we had, good weapons system. We had a turret in the front with a 40 millimeter and a minigun, and a sight to where you could move the sight and it would shoot left, right, up, down, wherever you point it. And then in the back, had a sight for the wing stores, and which was so much better than the old Huey. It had an iron sight. You'd literally pull down this iron thing with pieces of wire like this made a crosshair.
No.
You'd sort of aim, see where you were going, shoot, and
hope and pray.
Hope and pray. It was an area weapon. You were hoping to hit the grid square.
Oh no.
Yeah.
And so for day one, did you come back for a second sortie?
Not on day one. We inserted them, and then we went back to Khartoum. We got patched up, and we went home to await. On standby to see what's going to happen.
And because the mission plan here was unique in that prior missions where they ran company operations out of Khartoum, out of CCC. This is MAC VSOG, Command and Control Central, based in Khartoum, and we had air assets attached, of which you were a part of that. And for this mission, the commanding officer on the ground was Captain Gene McCarley. And he had run other missions where the team, Hatchet Force, would go in and set up a block on Ho Chi Minh Trail. Then they would get hammered by the North Vietnamese. So his theory was, we're going to go in, get on the ground, and move day and night, as opposed to having a static position that the NVA could focus, bring in their mortars, artillery, and things like that.
Right, exactly. You were a recon team 1-1, and you would go in, and your job was not to be seen or heard, but to observe.
Indeed.
Where with the Hatchet Force, they were usually platoon-sized operations, and they were in their reconnaissance in force, and they were meant to be seen and heard, and they would usually just build a defensive position overlooking the Ho Chi Minh Trail and hammer them. But this was a company-sized operation that Captain McCarley was running, and in support of a larger CIA op, and they were supposed to keep reinforcements from coming down this highway towards the CIA operation and be a diversionary force. So they
and again, just for a quick little thumbnail sketch, which you outlined actually by chapter in your book, what happened in March of 1970 that led to all this Operation Tailwind? Just a quick thumbnail on that, then get around to the operation.
Well, the genesis of it, the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which people are familiar with, brought all the men and all of the personnel from North Vietnam, but only about 30% of the equipment. 70% of the equipment actually went by sea, and it came around to Cambodia, to Sihanoukville.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, Prince Sihanouk was the communist leader of Cambodia, and from there they built the Sihanouk Trail, which brought all this equipment north. and to distribute in South Vietnam. So in March of 70, Prince Sihanouk was overthrown by one of his generals, and all of a sudden the Sihanouk Trail was shut down. So the communists needed a route to bring their equipment, so they thought if they could get control of the Mekong River Valley, the Mekong River flowed into the Mekong, and the Mekong flowed into South Vietnam, they could have that as a riverway to ship equipment. So the CIA had a lot of positions on the Bolivans Plateau overlooking the Mekong Valley, and the NVA attacked and captured these positions, which got the attention of people in the White House, and Henry Kissinger had this Washington Special Action Group that consisted of him and CIA, State Department, DOD, and others, and they came up with this. The CIA came up with the plan called Operation Gauntlet, and was to recapture the CIA position on this Bolivans Plateau and thereby control the Mekong River Valley. So the U.S. military got tasked. Operation Tailwind was as a diversion to this greater CIA operation, which had 5,700 mercenaries involved.
That many.
Yeah, it was huge.
And they were heavily engaged, and they needed the distraction of Operation Tailwind to pull away some of the NVA resources to give them a break in their combat.
Yeah. The trail was broken down into 27 bin trams, they were called. Each was responsible for a section of the trail, and each bin tram had like 2 infantry companies, a AAA battalion, and other assets, pipeline laying units and truck repair and everything else.
Yeah, because you had those good details in your book. Like in the end, they had, as you noted in your book, they had 27 bin trams from the top of the Ho Chi Minh Trail all the way down.
Yeah.
I mean, that was a major development. I never heard that number before, but thanks to your research, I mean, we knew they had the base camps, and again, whenever we had a target, it would be specifically for that little target area, but you got the bigger picture.
Yeah. But in addition to all the bin trams, they were static forces. They had mobile forces. They had an entire infantry division. They had 3 AAA regiments, and they had all these other units. So if there was a hot spot somewhere, they would use the roads and bring in anti-aircraft, more infantry and stuff like that. So Operation Tailwind was a diversion and to keep more people, more reinforcements from NVA reinforcements from getting down to the CIA operation.
Right. And then another number you had in your book that gave me cause to pause was by 1970, you had 90,000 NVA troops in Laos alone coming down the trail. And our numbers in 68 was around 25 to 30,000. And that was, your numbers are an indicator of how they escalated that. And that included the sapper teams, the hunter-killer teams that were designed just to go out to hunt and to kill SOG recon teams, or to kill the Americans, leave the indigenous alive for psychological purposes.
Yeah. Well, when the trail started, actually in 1959, it was basically a trail with these guys pushing a bicycle loaded like a pack mule with 100 kilos of rice or ammo or whatever. By 1970, there were pipelines, there were gravel roads with bridges that they'd build like a foot under the water surface so you couldn't see them from the air.
Sure.
There were,
several in fact, one of my last missions was a mission just to find it, to photograph it, and to wire it, so hope you can blow it up with an NVA truck on it. You know?
Yeah, they had 5 or 6 different pipelines, fuel, kerosene, whatever, and they had telecommunications. It was a engineering marvel.
Absolutely. They came hard. And, and that Ho Chi Minh Trail was first implemented when the Vietnamese were fighting the French. They had some in the earlier days, which was between 50 and 1954. Of course, in May of 54 was when the Vietnamese and the Viet Minh pushed out. They defeated the French at the final battle of Dien Bien Phu. Yeah. And from that point, the country was divided.
Right.
South was democratic, North was the communists, and of course the communists wanted everything.
Well, Marxism doctrine, workers of the world unite, but it's for the overthrow, and violent overthrow is accepted. So in May of '59, they started the 559th Transportation Group to start this trail, and basically to bring in troops and supplies to overthrow the government of Cambodia, of Laos, and of South Vietnam.
Sure. And the number 559
was May '59.
Yeah, it was May '59. Yeah. So this way, nobody can argue when they officially designated where we're going. But again, publicly, they never talked about it. They said, no, Laos is a neutral country. We have nobody there.
Yeah. And after the war ended in the later '70s, from what I've researched or been led to believe, all the records for the 559th were pretty much destroyed. So that's why it's hard to get information about the 559th.
Indeed.
Yeah, there were some histories written. They wrote some histories, but it's a lot of it's been destroyed.
And so then on this mission here, the team led by Captain McCarley had been on the ground for maybe an hour. They came across a major cache, and they got an intel coup there, and then at one point the phone rang.
It did,
and then the phone rang, and this is a telephone. They're in Laos, and the phone rings. And Captain Gene McCarley picked up the phone. Hello, 5th Special Forces Group. May I help you?
Yeah.
And to this day, it must be somebody new and confusion up there in Hanoi. Figured, wait a minute, how'd that happen?
Yes, someone speaking English.
But again, that was a major successful part. They got a lot of intelligence documents out of it, and then the Special Forces, excuse me, the people in charge of putting their engineers mined it, put it in there with explosives, and detonated everything, and then the A-1 Sky Raiders came in with napalm. I don't know if any of the other units came in with support on that, but they destroyed that enemy cache.
They did. The demo guys wired it up, and they said they had secondary explosions for hours.
For hours. Yeah, it's just a major success right there within the first couple hours. And then the other thing you pointed out in your book, which I was not aware of the extent, but other Army Cobra units and gun support ships. And tell me a little bit more about that, because just to expand on that, because you did it so well in your book.
Well, there was a Army Huey unit, call sign Bikini, and the Cobras that covered them were the Pink Panthers. Their bread and butter was going across the fence.
Right, they supported SOG for years too, like Scarface.
In case any of us got shot down, they were there to pick us up, the Hueys and the Cobras to cover them. Right. So they were involved in every. As a matter of fact, on the 7th, when we had
your first briefing,
the mortar attack, that was
right.
That was a Pink Panther
Cobra the attack,
on the cover of the book. That's a Pink Panther Cobra that got hit and blown up.
Kontum is where CCC was located, but they had two launch sites, Dak To, and there's a second launch site. It'll come to me soon. But you're at Dak To.
We're at Dak To.
And on day 7, September 7th, incoming rounds at the launch site took out one of their gunships.
Yeah. We were there and overstayed our welcome. We got there late morning and sat there for hours, and here's all these, Cobras and CH-53s just there. It gave the bad guys, how could they pass up such a target? So I was sitting on the roof of a bunker with a friend of mine, Pat Owen, and we're just sunning ourselves, taking selfies. Yeah. And one of our 53s was on the runway, and we were borrowing some flechette rockets from the Army because we could never get flechettes, and we found cases of them.
Yeah.
So they were borrowing some flechettes, and all of a sudden there's an explosion. And Joe Driscoll, who is on the back of this 53, and a guy named Joe Gallo. The pilot pulls pitch. Joe Gallo comes tumbling out. Driscoll and another guy, they land on top of him. Gallo ends up with a concussion and a broken arm.
Yeah.
And then this Army Cobra got hit. And Pete Gotch, the pilot of it, he gets... as soon as the first mortar hit, he says to his co-pilot, he says, "Let's go," meaning let's go to the bird.
Yeah.
co-pilot thought he meant let's go to the bunker where everybody else was running. So Pete goes to his aircraft. He unties the tail rotor, and here's a mortar coming. He hits the deck, and it lands on the other side of the runway. Goes around to the front of the helicopter to square away the co-pilot's gear so it won't be flying around the cockpit. Another one comes in. He hits the deck. It lands in front of the helicopter. He says, "Uh-oh, getting bracketed here." So then he's about to climb in the cockpit, and he hears another one come. So he gets down, hits the deck, and it lands right behind the stub wing in the rocket pod, blows out the canopy, blows out the cowling, starts the rockets on fire. And he's laying there on the ground and said, "Oh, better get out of here." He does a low crawl to a ditch, and then he starts running. And the picture on the front of the book shows the burning helicopter. But I took that picture and I had the slide for 50 years. I never noticed this guy running along the ditch in the front until I heard from this guy Pete, who gave me a call and told me his story. It was just classic. It was great.
And you had him on the front page.
Yeah, I put him on
the cover. Yeah.
But I'm on the roof of the bunker. Another aside. So I always have a camera with me. I start taking pictures. Boom, explosion here, explosion there. The 53 taking off. I'm taking pictures. Then we said, we better get in this bunker. It's getting dicey. We run down, a couple weeks later, I get my film developed, and I had taken beautiful pictures of the backside of the lens cover.
Oh, no.
Yeah, so I decided not to give up my day job and become a combat photographer right there. I said, that's not going to work. But I did get one shot from inside, and that's what's on the.
That's a great picture.
Yeah,
it really is.
Yeah.
So day one was a success. That night, per the mission statement, they moved at night, and they had Spectre gunships. Now, Spectre was a C-130. For our listening audience, gunships that had a platform that would link to the teams on the ground, and they could bring 7.62 minigun fire, 20 Mike cannons, and did they have the howitzers that back then in 1970?
I don't think they did.
Right, I mean, whatever firepower they had, they could bring it as well as drop flares.
They could,
and so that would help. And again, the mission was to disrupt, to do any intel gathering, and they already destroyed a major cache, got intelligence from it, which they carried on through the next 3 days of the mission, and returned back to base with it. And so on day two, they were in the early morning hours. The men of B Company could hear trucks and tracked vehicles in the distance. That meant, again, I'm going back to the book. That meant more NVA were coming to take up the hunt. So McCarley had his men on the move at first light. They were short on sleep and already running low on ammunition. As the troops departed their RON, which was the rest overnight site, they had a small skirmish with a squad of NVA, during which another American and 1 yard were wounded. A platoon of about 40 NVA attacked later in the morning, but B Company was able to break contact and continue to move. Within an hour, the determined enemy returned in force with a company of 150 soldiers attacked with machine guns, B-40 rockets, and mortars. McCarley called in the SPADs, and the SPADs was the code sign for A-1 Sky Raiders, to drive them back with CBUs, cluster bomb units, but not before 1 Montagnard was killed and another 15 were wounded. And that just gives you a sense of what they're up against on day two. Now, during a 2-hour engagement in the afternoon, McCarley, the medic Gary Mike Rose, Jim Lucas, and Adair were standing together. And this is the command element under McCarley. So each platoon leader was there. And they were standing together when a B-40 rocket sailed overhead, landed in a nearby bamboo thicket. Everyone was blown into the air and showered with hot shrapnel and needle-like bamboo splinters. While airborne, Rose remembers looking up and seeing his dirty jungle boots against the gray sky. Ignoring wounds to his head, hand, and foot, the medic began patching up the other soldiers. McCarley, suffering a leg wound, got on the radio and called in airstrikes to end the skirmish and allow the company to continue. And that's just a good flavor of what they're up against on the ground. It's just excellent work on your part. And the other side of this, like by the end of the day, they were trying to carry their dead with them because they always leave no man behind. And Mike Rose, who was the only medic on this mission, and you captured what he said, how at one point, because the terrain was difficult and movement was too slow to keep up with the company, Rose realized almost immediately they could not carry the dead, and he made an agonizing decision. He told the yards to leave the dead behind. This would haunt him for the rest of his life. Years later, he would recollect, "My mind drifts back over the years in this operation, and the thing I think about is that we left those guys behind. You don't even know their names. I can't remember their faces. I left them in the middle of nowhere, wrapped in a goddamn poncho. What a hell of a way to leave a couple of guys." And again, this is your writing here. It's just excellent. You caught the flavor of that moment. So for day 2, you guys were back again, even though you got your bird passed up. And with the CH-53s, did the Cobras use the same thing as the CH-53s? Because Larry Grohl, who was the crew chief for one of the CH-53 Deltas, told him how they use beer cans to cover up the holes.
Well, yeah, it's aluminum. You can just cut a patch and put it over it and put a few rivets in, and
you're good to go.
You're good to go.
And do you remember any other aspects from day 2 on this thing as the operation progressed?
Well, actually, the 12th, which was day 2,
right?
We didn't go down there.
Okay.
But the Army tried to get in, and
they're going in for the wounded.
Well, they left the 3 dead behind, but they had 2 litter patients.
Right.
And that was really slowing them down. And Gene McCarley's strategy of cat and mouse was he needed weather for air support, and he needed mobility. And carrying these litter patients was even more difficult than carrying the bodies.
Right.
Because the body, they just got a bamboo pole, put it in a poncho, put the body in a poncho, and you could be rough with it. But with the litter patients, it really slowed them down. So the Army was going to come in.
And Mike Rose, the medic, had to keep checking out their fluid levels, giving them painkillers occasionally as they moved.
Right.
So he's tending to them as well as the other members of the hatchet force that were getting wounded, patching up their wounds. Gene McCarley and Mike Rose also had, like you documented, the wounds to his hand and to his foot. The one on his foot, the shrapnel went through the jungle boot and cut it. He wrapped it with an ace bandage or something and continued to march. And to this day, his one hand cannot close. Because of the wound he received at that moment. But as a medic, he always joked about how the first couple of days he uses Car 15 as a crutch. It's like, whoa.
Yeah.
That gives you a flavor of what they're up against on the ground.
Well, Captain Mack, as they called Gene McCarley, told him to bring 5 to 10 times your normal amount of medical supplies. So everybody was carrying something. And the IV bags in plastic were a relatively new thing. He had some of those, but also had IV bottles.
Right.
And he'd try to hook up an IV bottle and gunfire, shatter them, so they ended up using the bags and just lay it on somebody's chest. And that's the best he could do.
But think about that. Lessons learned in combat, just giving somebody an IV that would only be 1.5 foot above the person lying on the ground.
Gets blown away.
Getting blown away.
Yeah.
To give you a sense of the gunfire, the intensity of it that they're under.
Right.
At different times in the day or night.
Yeah. So it was pretty critical to get those litter patients and the more seriously wounded. And the Army came in on the second day, on the 12th. And Cobra's leading this Huey in, and the Cobra ended up getting shot down. Took about 50 hits, crashed. A guy named Bob Litwinski was flying it, and the brand new CO, Major Henry, was in his front seat.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah, he was getting a feel for the lay of the land.
Oh, welcome to the Secret War, buddy.
It was his second tour, but he was getting a feel for the AO.
Yeah.
And they got shot down, so that called off that. Instead of a medevac, it became a air crew rescue, and they picked them up. The Bikini Huey picked them up, and they exfil.
And so, just a little bit here. What would a normal tactic be? So, your escort, just to say we have a UE, in this case the CH-53s on day one, when they go in, your gunships come in alongside, or would do a gun run first and then come back and parallel in with them? How would that normally work if you had the terrain to do it?
Yeah, we Marine Cobra tactics were a little different than Army tactics. We had 4 Cobras, so we'd have escort them in, and we generally set up a wagon wheel pattern around the LZ. And then when he came out, 2 Cobras would peel off, escort that guy out, pick up the next one, and bring him in, while the 2 remaining would deliver close air support for the troops on the ground. Now, the Army ran a thing, they called them the red and blue team. They'd take 2 of their Hueys if they had 4. 2 of them would get higher, and 2 lower that were going to the LZ, and they'd just fly at treetop level, and the guy above would guide them and saying, okay, a little right, little left, okay, you're a couple hundred meters out, okay, flare now. And they just couldn't even see the LZ maybe, and they come flare, landed in the LZ.
And the reason they did that was?
Well, the air threat, the 51 to 12.7,
sure.
And then as the battle went on, they started bringing in AAA from
37 Mike too.
37 millimeter anti-aircraft guns from these mobile forces that they had. They had 3 different anti-aircraft regiments, so this was a big operation with the CIA and stuff, and they were bringing stuff down the highway.
And again, when President Johnson at the end of '68 ended the bombing campaign in North Vietnam, the next day the communists were moving all kinds of, in addition to troops and supplies,
exactly,
more anti-aircraft, which made life much more difficult for aviators like yourself.
Yeah.
Anybody flying, and this is, even though this is the southern part of Laos, by then they had a lot of stuff down there to shoot helicopters down.
Yeah, a 37 millimeter is a threat to a fast mover at 10,000 feet. If it got a bead on you, a low-flying, slow helicopter, you were toast.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Oh, that's nasty. I can remember, because whenever we had our briefings before a mission, the Covey, which would be the forward air controller for us, the code name, he would come through and say, look, we know we have a 37 Mike here. 2 days ago, we saw a 12.7, which is 50 caliber, .1 or 51 caliber.
51 caliber.
And so that was a critical part of the morning briefing before you go into a target, any target.
Right.
And it only got worse. That's for sure. The challenges for the aviators never ended.
Yeah.
And so you also captured one other little scene here that I just got to go back to your book, because I never heard this before until I read your book. And again, I'm not going to be able to read the whole book today. I encourage everybody to get Operation Tailwind by Barry. And in it, this is night 2 on the ground. And Lucas was, this is after they had combat back and forth. They had called in gun runs. They used Spectre. And so Lucas is on the ground and, quote, back to the book, Lucas thought he heard some quiet moaning directly in front of his fighting hole and figured he might be able to snatch a prisoner. Without a sound, he slowly slithered out of his foxhole and crept forward in the darkness. He kept groping with his hand. After moving just a few yards, he touched something alive. Realizing it was somebody's arm, he grabbed it and started dragging the man back towards his foxhole. Suddenly, someone started to pull the wounded NVA soldier in the other direction. Thinking discretion, the better part of valor in this instance, Lucas released the arm and quietly returned to the perimeter. He later described it as, quote, one of those crazy things you don't want to think about anymore, close quote. Oh, my God. How did you get that? That's just amazing.
Yeah. After the years after this ended, Jim Moriarty, who you know was doing a documentary.
Yes.
And this was 2002, I want to say, and did interviews.
A fellow Marine who had 3 tours of duty.
3
with
tours
the
as
Marine Corps, including tours as a door gunner.
Yeah. So he was having this documentary produced, and there were interviews with all these people. So Jim graciously allowed me access to all his tapes. And I got this story, when Jimmy Lucas was interviewed. But that was the night of the grenade battle. McCarley had set up this perimeter, and in the middle was a bomb crater where Mike Rose had put most of his wounded,
right.
And he's trying to tend to them, in the dark as best he could. Well, the NVA comes and they use bamboo sticks to signal. One click. They'd bang them together, move forward. 2 clicks, bang, bang, throw your grenades. 3, retreat, right? So no one knows where anyone is, and no one wants to fire because a muzzle flash is going to give it away. So this grenade battle breaks out, and SF guys are throwing grenades that way, NVA's throwing them this way, and they must have run out of grenades. They heard a truck coming and boxes being unloaded off of a truck. No more grenades are coming. But in one of these lulls...
These are NVA trucks.
Yeah. In one of these lulls, Jimmy Lucas decides, I hear some moaning out there.
Yeah.
And that's what he said. It sounded like a good idea at the time. I'm going to crawl out there and see what I can
see
find.
if I can grab a POW.
Yeah.
Oh, my gosh. Well, also that night, you captured another scene where they were working with Spectre. And the Spectre's a gunship, the C-130 weapons platform that could bring the rounds as within 20 meters of a team or even closer if they asked for it. And so Lucas and Bernie Bright have been controlling a Spectre gunship in front of their sector, and they were walking the rounds closer on each pass. Excuse me. And going back to the book, the Spectre pilot said he was running low on fuel and that he had time on station for 2 more passes. Jimmy Lucas tells the story. I told him, from the last pass, bring it in 250 more meters. The pilot said, that's your position. I said, well, if you don't get us, they will. So bring it in. When he came in the last pass, he was cutting down trees, and they were falling over our perimeter. To me, that was what broke the contact for that night, because after that, we didn't hear anything except them moving off. It was just about light, but I think if it hadn't been for him and his close air support, we'd have been overrun at first light in the morning. That's at the end of day 2.
Day 2, yeah.
Whoa.
There were several instances where they came close to being overrun. The game of cat and mouse, they needed mobility, and with these patients, the litter patients, they couldn't quite outrun the NVA.
Right.
So the air support let them break contact, and they'd move on somewhere else.
Man, oh man. So by now, we begin day 3, and day 3, McCarley has his hands full, and they want to try to get some of the wounded out if possible. And by now, they're bringing down the 37 Mike, anti-aircraft weapons, and also food was running low, but hunger was the least of their worries when being hunted by people bent on their annihilation. As supplies dwindled, ammunition became the biggest concern. All magazines from the wounded were distributed to those still fighting, and strict fire discipline was implemented. And that's just, you captured again so well the men on the ground that you guys are supporting there. And did you ever get a sense of that from being up in the air about how things work? Because you get your briefings in the morning.
We got it from the briefings. Not once we were in the air. We were, just busy doing what we were doing and didn't have long discussions with Gene McCarley or anybody on the ground. Usually,
Of
talk
course.
to Covey, but it was becoming dire for the.
As you would
hatchet
say, it
force.
was a real shit show.
It was a shit sandwich. We used to call it.
We'll get into a little bit more of that anachronism a little bit later on here. And so at some point, the decision was made to bring in another CH-53 Delta in from the Marine Corps to pick up the wounded. And the pilot was Beardall?
Beardall, yeah.
And so he was the lieutenant at the time, right?
He was. He was the bull lieutenant, the senior lieutenant in the squadron.
Okay.
At the time.
So he's flying. They come down to, they finally find an LZ. And again, back to your book, Beardall came to a hover above the zone. And as he began to descend vertically to the ground, he found himself in a tug of war with the major and yelled over the income, "Get off the controls, get off the controls." And he's dealing with another officer, and he just wanted to get down. So again, we're quoting the book now. Sergeant Folan, the crew chief, was looking for trees on both sides and guiding the bird on its vertical descent when they started taking heavy fire. The helicopter was about 5 feet off the ground as Doc Rose and Cooch was the indigenous team member who supported Mike Rose. And Mike had been training him to become a team medic.
Yeah.
And so Doc Rose and Cooch began braving intense enemy fire, attempted to pass the first litter patient up to Doc Paget, while Brown, another medic that was on the aircraft, held Paget's belt to keep him from falling out. Before the exchange, so imagine, they're just hanging it up
5 feet in the
5
air.
feet
They're
in the
hovering.
air. It's a hover.
Yeah.
They're reaching up, and before the exchange could be made, the main rotor struck the tree on the left. Fighting severe vibration, Beardall aborted the attempt and began climbing out. And that's just, that little moment in time, just hard to imagine.
Yeah.
And as they're going up, the RPG came into the cabin, but didn't explode, but still had an impact inside.
Right. Yeah.
And the RPG miraculously did not explode, but hit the ceiling, taking out several hydraulic lines. Seeing the red fluid streaming from the roof, Folan yelled, "Get on the ground now!" A CH-53, this is where you wrote this, a CH-53 without hydraulics is just like a large, free-falling chunk of metal dropping from the sky. There was no time to waste.
That's right.
Lord. And then there was one other thing. Of course, Beardall yells into the microphone, "Mayday, Mayday, we're going in." Straight ahead was a suitable area. He began his approach, and just as he touched down, Beardall lost control of his entire rotor as the last of the hydraulic fluid was pissed overboard. He landed on a field of scrub and tall grass and began shutting down the engines as Major Carroll was securing the fuel and applying the rotor brake, to no avail. By that time, they shut down the aircraft, and so everybody was able to successfully get out of that. And that, I think, we had, during that scene, you also captured another moment with Larry Grohl, who was the door gunner on that.
On the SAR aircraft that was coming in to pick them up.
Very good. Thank you for the clarification, because I just love the way you document this with the book. And so Larry's on the door gunner, and he wrote, "My heart felt like it had moved up my throat and was racing at a rapid fire pace. As we made the descent to the crash site, my senses were at their best, my finger on the trigger, ready to go to work. As we got closer to the pickup site, I could see that it was surrounded by smoke that was laid down by the cobras of Scarface. along with their rockets and 40 millimeters rounds to protect the crew on the down chopper. Just about the time we came into a hover over the down crew, it happened. Bam, bam, bam was all the sound I heard as the NVA opened up with a 51 caliber anti-aircraft gun on my side of the aircraft. They were about only 25 yards away from our bird when they opened up. I can't imagine that. A 50 caliber that close?
Yeah.
The muzzle flash from their gun was used and seemed to be the size of a basketball. Without a second thought, I pulled back on the trigger of my M60 and then did not let up until the anti-aircraft gun crew was silenced. We started to bounce around, and I knew that we had taken some hits. I took a quick look towards the cockpit and saw both Mark and Rao fighting to keep us in the air. Good God, that's Larry.
Yeah, that's Larry Crow, right.
So they were able to land, or no, they had to hover. So take it from there a little bit further on day 3.
Excuse me. Well, to the beginning of the mission, when Bill Beardall comes in, usually he'll have one pilot flying and the other is lightly on the controls. Well, the XO happened to be flying with him that day, Major Carroll.
Right.
And he's doing a little bit more than lightly and sort of trying to fly the aircraft, and you can't have two people flying at once. So that's how that happened. They end up hitting the tree, took the RPG, and they put it down and just lost tail rotor authority as they hit the scrub brush. But the SAR bird was a guy named Mark McKenzie, and they were orbiting a few clicks away. And our CO, Harry Sexton, calls for the SAR bird, and they had their tail to the situation, didn't know where it was. So Colonel Sexton puts down a few smokes to mark the area.
Yeah.
And there's the picture in the book of the bird sitting in the zone and some smokes out there. So Mark McKenzie comes in, and they had this ladder on the back, an extract ladder. It's about 6 foot wide, had 3 steel cables with aluminum rungs on it, 80 feet long. And they just roll it right out the back ramp, and it hangs down. So they came in next to the Beardall's bird, and as soon as they hit the ground, the 2 SOG medics, Paget and Brown, and the crew chief and the gunners came out and set up a perimeter while the pilots are shutting down the aircraft. They all go out, clip onto the ladder. Beardall's the last guy on the ladder, and he's down at the bottom. He weighs 140 pounds. He's a small guy. Weighs 140 pounds, and he sees the end of as they're taking off. He sees the bottom of this thing starting to
the ladder.
Aluminum ladder floating, flapping in the breeze, and he thinks, "Geez, I hope it doesn't come up and hit the tail rotor." So he decides, I better climb down near the end so I can put some weight on the end.
All 140 pounds.
All 140 pounds of him. So he starts to climb, and he says, no way, forget that. And he stopped. Oh. But there's a picture, it's kind of fuzzy, but you see all these guys on the ladder.
Right.
And then a ways down, you see this last little blob, and that's Bill Beardall. But Mark McKenzie's flying it, and they were getting hosed as they're hovering there with the ladder, and the guy's hooking on, and he says to the crew chief, "Make sure everybody is on the ladder because I don't want to come back here."
Yeah, no kidding.
And they took off, and then they had some hydraulic fluctuations.
Sure, because the rescue aircraft that rescued the downed aircraft.
So the SAR bird's having problems, so they find a place, an opening, and they come, and you got to gently lay down and kind of move forward so the ladder kind of lays out along the ground slowly. and the guys can unhook. And then another 53 comes in and lands next to them. Everybody gets on that. And the crew chief says, "No, I think we can make it. Otherwise, they were going to abandon that aircraft too."
That's Larry Grohl.
Yeah, Larry Grohl. We would have lost 2 in one day. They really piss off the heavies. So they said, the crew chief says, "No, I think we can make it," and they left. So it was kind of 2 pickups within 10 minutes, or less.
And that's just amazing. Then when Larry got back, I think that he found that the state of that CH-53 needed a lot more maintenance.
Yeah.
Because they had some very strategic damage.
Yeah, they were lucky to make it back.
They were so lucky.
Yeah. Yeah.
But again, just another day in SOG.
Yeah, another day across the fence.
So again, that night, excuse me, at the end of day 3, they're on the ground. They move during the day, and they move that night. And again, there's intense. Oh, I forgot. Day 3, there was attempts to do a resupply. Tell me about that, because there was 2 separate attempts.
Yeah, two. Well, one, the Covey, they came out of Play Coup, and they said, well, we got to get these guys resupplied somehow or other. So they back at the squadron, they come up with this plan. They got found an old cargo parachute, got some duffel bags, filled one with gas masks, one with claymores, and one with ammunition. They tied them all together to this cargo parachute, put them in the back of an OV-10. They took there's a clamshell door off of this little cargo compartment in an OV-10. You know what that looks like.
Sure.
Put a SOG guy in there. Said, well, we're going to fly over them, the hatchet force. When I turn on the green light, he tells the SOG guy, just kick out this parachute. So they fly over. Green light goes on. He kicks out the chute. Drogue chute comes out and disintegrates in a puff of green smoke. It was just dry rotted, so it never pulled out the other.
Right.
The whole bundle goes into the hillside where the NVA is. So Covey spends most of the afternoon running airstrikes on that hillside to keep the enemy from getting all the claymores and the ammunition and stuff. Then later, the Army thought they could come in with the Huey and get at least those 2 litter patients.
Right.
And they came in and gave it a try. And I didn't know this until after I wrote the book, and I heard from this fella down in Florida, Woody Woodall, I think his name was. And he's in the Cobra. They're bringing in this Huey, and they got shot up so much they limped back home, and it was unsuccessful. So there were 3 attempts on that day, on the 13th, to get them out. And meanwhile, SOG, the hatchet force, is just kind of getting into extremis.
Right, and they were talking about trying to get a combat spear mission, which I'd never heard that term before.
Combat spear was a special C-130 operation for resupply. It's this low level. You fly right down the runway or right over the LZ, a few feet up. Yeah, like they did at Quezon. You have a little chute, extracts the pallet right off. Right. They just fly. They don't land or anything. They fly 10 feet off the ground, pull the load out, and take off. Combat spear usually required a 48-hour lead time, but Mac v. SOG went right to Admiral McCain, who was Sink Pack, had the whole Pacific Command. Admiral McCain's son, John McCain, was a POW in North Vietnam at the time. They sent a message to him and he said, okay, you're approved for this combat spear drop. And it was actually going to be 3,700 pounds on the morning of the 15th at 1 o'clock in the morning. And it was only 2.5 clicks from where they were. And they were going to resupply them with 3,700 pounds of equipment and stuff. That was
scheduled for the 15th.
Actually, yeah, just past midnight at 1 o'clock in the morning.
So day 4.
That was the plan.
Yeah, indeed. Like all
indeed,
good plans.
All good plans.
So and during that night, again, they were in heavy combat, and they worked Spectre during the night between flares, gun runs, and the team did move at least once or twice. And so they come to day 4. Day 4 is September the 14th.
September 14th.
And again, your book said that SOG had a relatively quiet night with intermittent probing. But there was 2 major developments. First, the NVA continued to bring in additional reinforcements. Now, again, I'm returning to the book, and today we won't be able to cover the entire book, but there's a lot in it that we can at least make a reference to. And here, this is documenting that mission. Captain Mack was unaware of some other developments, but first, the NVA continued to bring things south. The second development was the same bugaboo they had faced with the landing, the weather. As the wet season dragged on, the forecast called for a low ceiling for the next several days, making air support questionable. Without air support, the grunts were toast. And that's, you captured the essence of that moment.
They needed mobility, which they didn't have because of the litter patients, and they needed air support. Excuse me. We had briefed on the night of the 13th at 2100.
Really?
We briefed, and it was going to be a medevac and resupply once again.
For day 4.
For day 4. But, excuse me, day 4 opened up low ceilings, heavy fog. Excuse me. Low ceilings, heavy fog, and Covey couldn't get in. There were 2 SPADs from Da Nang tried to get in at first light. They had to turn around and come back. McCarley more troops are coming in, and he's basically surrounded, and he makes a perimeter for a last stand. A second set of SPADs, SPAD 3 and 4, excuse me, take off from Da Nang, and it's a guy named Tom Stump.
Right.
Tom Stump's leading it, and Chris Tashisha, I think was his co-pilot's name. The weather's really bad, but they take off, and they just fly off a navigational aid called a VOR out Da Nang. They fly out a 236-degree radial.
But let me interrupt for a second, because before he got in that defensive posture, earlier day 4, he was able, the team came to a second enemy cache. And you documented that well, too. And they found numerous hooches and bunkers. It appeared was a major headquarters complex. There were sleeping quarters that had bunks with mattresses stacked 3 high, and other bunkers with truck parts and stores of rice. There was also a mess hall, and the Captain Mack got a call to come and look at an underground command bunker. When he arrived, he found a room with map-covered walls. On one wall, a framed picture of Ho Chi Minh was prominently displayed, but the treasure trove was footlockers full of documents, records, code books, currency, and logs. The captain ordered his men to pack up as many of the documents as they could carry, as he emptied his own rucksack and filled it with papers. As the men left the bunker, one of the yards came out and handed Sergeant Schmidt the photo of Ho Chi Minh, which they brought back. And it took less than an hour to clean it and search all the buildings. The demo team's guys went to work as SOG moved out. They blew the place sky high. Then also, there had been the only presence of NVA SOG were the stay-behinds. And they were just no match for Captain McCarley's troops. They pushed them all out. They got their documents. Again, that was part of this great intel coup that they pulled off. And afterwards, as they moved forward, that was when they got to this position where the weather was lousy, and it was a shit sandwich in the making for the Hatchet Force because of the bad weather after the successful morning. And that was when they got into that defensive posture. And we got to talk about Operation Location Alpha Alpha, or OLAA. And that was the group of SPAD pilots from the Air Force. So named as one of the most obscure titles for a tactical air unit I've ever heard. The Operation Location Alpha Alpha, and the commanding officer was Lieutenant Colonel Mel Swanson. And this small detachment of 10 A-1 Sky Raiders and a dozen pilots was a tight-knit group based in Da Nang. And there were other squadrons that were in Thailand that were separate. But the OLAA had 2 sections of A-1s ready at sunrise. And so this is where now the team is in their defensive posture on the ground. And Tom Stump and his wingman, Lieutenant Chris Tatisha, is flying together. And the key thing was to be able to link McCarley with the SPADs. And Stump got, again, going back to the book, Tom Stump, this is the name of the pilot we're talking about here, got to the general area by navigating off of a Da Nang signal. The ceiling was low as 500 feet. Visibility less than a mile obscured all landmarks. When he got close to the hatchet force, he called McCarley on the FM radio and used his automatic direction finding to lock in on Captain Mac's radio transmissions as he dodged mountains and enemy gunfire. I mean, good God. So once he finally located the now surrounded hatchet force, Stump checked in with McCarley, who said they were under heavy fire. They were in that perimeter you mentioned, and the NVA had massed and were making a final push to annihilate the Americans in the yards. Without air support and low on ammo, their hours were numbered. And again, going back to the book, when McCarley heard Stump on the radio, he directed the A-1s to his position and began running the close air support. McCarley started the A-1 runs about 50 meters from his perimeter and kept walking. He kept walking them in closer on every pass. Seeing the friendly's location, Stump called McCarley and said, "We're getting mighty close." With the NVA closing, McCarley said, "Bring it in close. Put it in my hip pocket." "Which pocket? Right or left?" responded Stump. Stump and Tatisha made passes so near to the SOG troops that the ejected shell casings from their 20 Mike cannons was falling on them. Later, Tom Stump recalls, "My wingman and I took quite a bit of ground fire, including RPGs, and I could hear the automatic weapons and explosions of the ground attack on the team through Gene's radio. It was obvious the bad guys were using the bad weather to try to overrun them. The original mission was to evacuate a couple of wounded, but it became clear to me that we had to get them out or we were going to lose them. I didn't know at the time that they had found a large cache of intelligence and that the bad guys wanted to keep them from getting away with the documents." Another key aspect. "All I could tell was there were a lot of bad guys. The team was completely surrounded. The NVA were serious about taking them out." Stump then called Hillsborough, which was the airborne command control ship that flew over the AO, and the radio relay, and he told him, "If you don't get them out now, they're not getting out." And so that went on. Then the RPG firing positions and driving the NVA back. This allowed the hatchet force to break contact with the enemy for a moment. The weather began to improve, and just before the A-1s ran out of ordnance, Covey pilot Gary Green and his Covey rider arrived with one A-1 from the NKP to continue the attack. Afterwards, the NVA hordes that were chasing the hatchet force, the Covey rider called McCarley and said, "You got to get them out now." If it hadn't been for Tom Stump and Chris Tahisha, it's likely the hatchet force would have been overrun.
Exactly.
That just shows you the gravity of that moment.
Yeah.
And it's just so well written.
Yeah. And it, as you said, Gene McCarley's on the move before sunrise, before first light, and they attacked that base camp. That's when the first two Spads were trying to go, and Covey's trying to get in, and they can't get in. Then later on, Tom Stump gets in just when things are really going to shit for Gene McCarley and his hatchet force. Save the day, and I think if it weren't for Tom Stump and Chris, that they might have been overrun. They might not have made it out.
Well, yeah, and for any of our viewers, we interviewed Captain Rose, and that is SOGcast number 008, and that is Mike's perspective, and he agrees with you 100%. Had it not been for Stump at that moment and Gene McCarley, they would have been overrun.
Yeah, and Tom Stump says Gene McCarley was Yeah, there was no Covey. Covey couldn't get in because of
Yeah.
the weather, and this ADF function that you read, you can turn this switch on your radio, FM radio, to ADF. It's automatic direction finding. So when someone keys their mic, this needle points right where it is. So Stump's flying out here 71 miles from Da Nang, calling on the radio. When he hears McCarley, he flips in and he says, okay, they're over this way, and then goes around the mountains and finds them, and they save the day. But it was touch and go.
And it's like in my case, we never knew they had that capacity. Again, here's the old World War II warplane that was used in the Korean War. And during the Vietnam War, whenever our teams were on the ground, they preferred SPADs and, of course, the gunships because they could come in so close.
Yeah, and they had such loiter time. The fast movers could give you, 10 minutes on station, and Tom Stump could hang out all day.
Well, then, so thanks to that attack, B Company was able to move, but the NVA remained in hot pursuit, and the company was in dire straits, without a doubt, because Mike Rose was now caring for nearly 50 wounded. He was out of medical supplies. He began sharing each morphine syringe among 4 casualties. So instead of giving a casualty a full syringe, he would give him a little bit.
A little pinch.
And using the same needle. Which
Yeah.
Anybody at the
That's
medical
verboten.
school.
Yeah.
Yeah, verboten for sure. And this just goes on. And they make contact. They finally they find an LZ. They're able to move to the LZ, carrying the wounded, carrying the intelligence, papers, maps, everything. They get to the LZ, and are you involved in any of that as with the support? Because now the weather's breaking. Now they get conventional air cover in there, without having to have Tom Stump pull a miracle to get below the clouds to see him.
Yeah. Well, as I said, the night before we briefed, and it was going to be a resupply and extract.
Right.
To medevac.
When did that change then?
Well, in the morning when Tom Stump got in there and he saw the situation and called Hillsborough and said, if you don't get them out now, they're not getting out. And then the weather improved a little and Covey got in there, and that's when Covey Ryder talked to Gene McCarley, who was under the impression they were just going to get a medevac and resupply and he'd continue the fight.
Right.
But Covey Ryder says to Gene, you got to get out now. So by morning of the 14th, when we brief, instead of being a medevac as we briefed the night before, said, no, where it's an extract, they're in extremis, we're going to have to use CS and to gas the area and hopefully stand a chance of getting them out. And that's when it's changed. And that's when they then sent a message to Hawaii to cancel the combat spear.
Yeah.
On my website, I found those messages. So I have copies of the request and the coordinates for it and the cancellation of it. So that all happened within a 24-hour period.
And what's your website?
BarryPencek.com.
Keep it simple.
Yeah.
Very good. Yeah. As Pencek, Pencek.
Even I can remember that.
But you just went over a key part of this discussion in the briefing. Gas mask. CS is tear gas.
CS is tear
and
gas.
They were preparing to use that because the situation was so desperate on the ground that they were going to use that. And again, you mentioned that in your book, how we were again giving gas masks just before we departed Khartoum. The M24 Aviator's gas mask had an integral microphone built into it that allowed a pilot to plug into the aircraft radios to communicate while maintaining an airtight seal around the face. It also had smooth head straps that fit comfortably. What was it like flying with a gas mask?
Well, common sense says you should never try something for the first time in the middle of a firefight. But they gave us these gas masks. I never even tried it on or anything. We're approaching the area and they say mask up. Some guys got aviation gas masks. You put it on, you put your helmet over it, and you plug your mic in. So there's a microphone in the mask, and you can talk on the radios. You got to go. We got these old Mark 17, the grunt masks. Well, you put it on. There's these big buckles up on
Right.
top. You adjust.
Sure.
There's no mic. So put my helmet on, and immediately I feel this excruciating pain, like someone's sticking a screwdriver in my head. Where these buckles are, because you got these form-fitted helmets.
Yeah.
And then we're trying to talk, so we get our boom mic and pick up the mask and stick it in there. Well, first we tried holding the mic to our throat to see if we could communicate, and it didn't work. So we picked up the mic, stuck the mic in there, but then you break the seal. So it's of no use.
Sure.
So we just took off the mask, said the hell with it.
Is that right?
Yeah, and that's what that's what all the other crews did on the Cobras, and some of them on the 53s.
So at some point, now you're heading towards the LZ. You're escorting, you and the other gunships are escorting the CH-53 Deltas from the Marine Corps, heading to pick up this team. And on the ground, A-1 Skybriders came in and made runs with cluster bomb units, CBU-30 dispensers that were dropped, and that had tear gas. And so the team on the ground, some men got their masks on, some didn't. But more importantly, it disoriented the NVA enough so that by the time you get there, and again, this is your book about you, as we neared the LZ, and again, you're supporting the ships in that Marine Corps fashion tradition, going in, guarding them. The fast movers were dropping heavy stuff on the highway and surrounding ridges, silencing anti-aircraft guns, or at least diverting their attention away from us. The A-1Es were unloading within a couple hundred meters of the SOG perimeter. We brought in the first transport and set up a tight left orbit around the LZ, firing outward at the attacking horde. The bullets hitting the helicopter sounded like popcorn popping, and I scrunched down in the armor seat just a little bit more as I fired the chunker. And what's your chunker, the 40 mic?
40 mic, yeah.
Oh my God. How many rounds do you ever count how many bullet holes from that day?
No, we didn't.
We just had it. But
we just had them.
I mean, that description sounded like popcorn popping. And this is you escorting the CH-53 Delta in.
But it's kind of a funny thing. We had lousy weather, and the forecast was even worse. And it was horrible in the morning, as evidenced by Tom Stump barely getting in. But as if by magic, as we got there, the weather improved and improved and improved. And we had been promised fast movers, they said, stacked all the way to heaven. And we never had any for the first 3 days. And on the last day, it was a thing of beauty. It was, concentric rings, the fast movers bombing out here, and the A-1s in the middle.
Anti-aircraft.
Yeah, trying to silence that.
And you're still getting them with small arms fire at the minimum.
It was wonderful.
And you also captured another moment in time here. Again, going back to the book, to Sergeant First Class Bernie Bright of the 3rd Platoon. He carried a 2-foot by 2-foot orange signal panel in his rucksack to mark the LZ. Disregarding his own safety, he took the panel from his pack, stood up in the middle of the LZ, and held it to his chest to guide in the first aircraft under enemy fire.
Yeah.
And he didn't get shot.
Mm-mm.
And
did it again.
Right. Well, yeah. And of course, Bernie thought that because of the first day mission, they used 4 helicopters. He had thought there's going to be 4 helicopters coming in that day to pick everybody up. And you had somehow, with your interview here, going back to the book, 1 down, 3 to go, thought Bernie Bright as the first aircraft departed. Between arriving helicopters, or when one was sitting on the ground, Bright stuffed his RH panel in his shirt, turned, dropped to one knee, and resumed firing his Car-15 at the advancing enemy. At the second bird approached, Bright stopped firing, turned around, and again stood up, exposing himself to enemy fire, and held up his orange panel. The fire grew more intense as Bill Jones and Bernie Sierra and the second bird homed in on Bright's orange panel. As Bright remembers it, he attempted to land on me with his nose wheel, and I did my best to roll out of his way. I'm sure what he was doing was listening to the crew chief in the back telling him to move forward. My feet were tangled up in the grass, so it was difficult for me to move anywhere really quick. I remember looking at the two pilots sitting in the helicopter looking out the window, and they had their visors down on their helmets. It looked like a couple of guys sitting at a red light waiting for the light to change. That's what went through my head. Just one of those strange things that popped into my head. That's just so well done. And so then Bernie, going back to Bernie's thought process. 2 down, 2 to go, thought Bernie, as the second helicopter lifted off from the zone. The third 53 was flown by 22-year-old Don Persky, a prior enlisted Marine with an Earl Flynn mustache who had come up through the enlistment commissioning program. Bill Batty was the co-pilot, and 20-year-old Sergeant John Snipes from South Carolina was the crew chief. Snipes had named his bird Mutter's Worry and hoped it would make it through the day without too much damage. So this is the third bird coming in. Bernie Sticken is going to be 4. And that's just a funny line. And so after the helicopter landed, Bright once more turned, dropped to one knee, and began firing at approaching NVA. Such valor.
Yeah. Crazy.
And he survived that. I mean,
he did.
And so from there,
well, that's when he saw Gene McCarley and Morris Adair and others running for the helicopter and said, well, wait a minute, this must be the last ride out of Dodge. So he turned around and started running toward the rear of the helicopter, ducking under the windows as the yards are firing out the windows.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
And so one of the things that happened too, because of the tear gas, it had its impact. It really disoriented some of the NVA soldiers, because McCarley and Rose all said how they were so close to that tail because the back men could run up that tail to get into the CH-53. They were NVA so close that they could have thrown hand grenades. But fortunately, they had enough rounds to kill these guys as they were approaching them.
Yeah.
And they were able to get on. Bernie finally realized, this could be the last bird out. He gets on the helicopter, and it takes off. So as it's lifting off, who was it the Marine door gunner? Was it Snipe or someone else? As it's lifting off, a round shot one of the Marine Corps crew chief or a door gunner.
Stevens.
Was it Stevens?
Shaky Stevens, they call him Shaky. Shaky. He had this penchant.
Tell us what happened.
Well, he had this penchant for Western novels. He always had a Louis L'Amour paperback in his flight suit. Yeah. Well, he took a round right through the neck, and he falls down and he's gurgling into the open mic. So this is the third bird, and we don't know that everybody's on the bird.
Oh, is that right?
Because we have a fourth one standing by to come in. We use 4 to put them in, 4 to take them out. So our CO, Colonel Sexton, is trying to call Persky and say, do you have everybody? Do you have everybody? And can't get through because here's Shaky Stevens gurgling into this.
From his blood.
Yeah, yeah, from his blood. So Sexton held up the last 53. He went over to the zone, made a low pass over the zone, looked at it, got hosed down, and said, looks like everybody's out.
Yeah, and you captured so well, because here's this Marine been shot through the neck. He was bleeding like a stuck pig. Rose removed the wounded man's helmet to treat him. He stabilized his neck as best as he could to keep it from flopping. Having seen the severe bleeding that often comes with neck wounds, Rose put Stevens on his knees so he wouldn't inhale blood. Then he saw the look on the Marine's face and knew Stevens was going into shock. Not knowing what to do, Rose remembered something he was told in medic training by an old SF master sergeant. Make them pissed at you. So pissed that they want to hit you. Rose leaned down and yelled in Stephen's ear, "Look, you stupid son of a bitch. If you were going to die, you'd be dead by now." Stephen stabilized. It's that classic moment in time.
Yeah.
Oh, my God. You captured that so well in your book.
But it was $1 million wound. Can you imagine a round going through your neck, didn't hit the jugular veins, the esophagus, the trachea, spine. When he was bleeding profusely.
Oh, yeah.
He spent 3 days in the hospital, and that was it. Crazy.
So again, so this aircraft, as it's taking off, and we're in mountainous Laos, one engine goes out.
Yeah, as they're on the ground, one engine goes out.
Oh, they're right on the ground?
Gets shot out. Yeah. So,
oh my God.
So Persky's taking off, gently milking one. As the perimeter's collapsing, the last guy gets on. Gene McCarley said 5 NVA come crawling through the weeds, through the elephant grass, and the 3 old men, he and Bernie Bright, and I think it was Adair.
Adair, yeah, he
mowed them down. And because Gene often said to me, I never understood why they didn't just throw a grenade in. They were that close. But
yeah.
So they're climbing out. Crew chief is Doug Snipes. I forget his first name. But Persky says, "Okay, remove your masks." They're a few thousand feet in the air. Remove your masks. He takes his mask off, leans back, and says, "That was great." Pulls out some cigarettes, starting to light a smoke.
No.
And the SF guys start screaming at him and pointing to the ceiling, and here's fuel just raining down from the ceiling.
Which knocked out the first engine. So they flew over one mountaintop, and again, they're nearby these mountains are nothing but a crash site. They're potential crash sites, sides of mountains. They go over a second mountain range, and as they get over it, or right after they get over the second range.
Well, they're climbing out, and the fuel's coming down. Persky's to call the lead aircraft and said, we have wounded on board. We may have to go to Khartoum, right to the hospital. And all of a sudden, the second engine quits, and it's quiet as a church. So they're coming down. Well, on helicopters, the important thing is your rotor RPMs. People always say to you, keep your turns up, keep your turns up. It's like telling a fighter pilot,
which we call auto rotation.
Yeah, watch your 6. Because in an auto rotation, you're falling through the air, and the wind coming up through the rotor blade keeps your turns up. So you want to keep your turns up. So Persky calls Mayday, waiting for someone to. There's a pregnant pause. He's waiting for someone to say.
You got to get the collective.
You got to lower it to lower the pitch on the blades so that it'll keep spinning as you're falling down. And a pregnant pause, waiting for someone to say, well, there's an opening, an LZ off to the left or the right. And no one says anything. It's just jungle. So he has a choice. He can shoot an auto to the top of the jungle canopy, and you want your turn, your turns up. And then what you do at the bottom, you flare to stop your forward speed and your rate of descent, and you flare, you lower the nose, and then you pull up the collective and use all that built-up energy in the rotor system to stop yourself. But he'd be shooting an auto to the top of a canopy, which could be 100 or 150 feet in the air, and then you're just going to come through the trees or whatever.
Right.
Well, there's a ridge line there. And he says, well, I can make it over the ridge line if I bleed off a little my RPM. So he pulls up on the collective a little to make it over the ridge line, hoping for a better day on the other side. Yeah. Gets over the ridge line, and here's this steep ravine with a river in the bottom. But Batty, his co-pilot, remembers RPM was about 85%. He didn't have all his turns. So they come down. Persky says, I think we got to land in the water. And Batty says, well, no, we got wounded on board. So there's this little sandy area to the left of the water. Shoot an auto there, and it's a hard landing. The thing hits, rolls over, breaks in half. It's like everyone's topsy-turvy, turned upside down. And Batty has a broken back. The thing's on its side. Batty's hanging in his straps above Persky. The guys in the back are just topsy-turvy. Mike Rose starts throwing people out, leading them out, going back in. There's fuel raining everywhere. Fortunately, it didn't burst into flames.
Oh, my God.
They're pulling all these people out. Meanwhile, the SAR bird comes in, and a guy named Tucker is flying it. And there's not room to land, so he kind of hovers over the water, puts one wheel on a rock, the nose wheel and the other main mount are in the air, and he lowers the ramp to the riverbank, and they start loading these guys on. Batty gets out the window, or out the door, falls in the grass, and he can't move, and he's yelling because he said, they're all leaving, and I'm going to be stuck here in Laos, and he can't move.
Upside down with a broken back.
With a broken back. He said some yard comes along. He said the kid looked like he was 12 years old. Snatches him like it was a loaf of bread. Just grabs him, drags him to the helicopter and puts him in there like it was no effort at all.
Wow.
Yeah.
And then you captured, getting back to Mike Rose again for our medic. In the rear of the smoldering helicopter, Doc Rose began throwing equipment out of the back to get to the wounded. Unfortunately, Keith Plassick was standing in the way. He took several hits from flying gear. One at a time, Rose would grab a wounded soldier, hang a rifle around his neck, and push him towards the rear, where another American would pass the confused man along bucket brigade style until everyone was out. Later, Captain Gene McCarley said to Rose, considering the leaking fuel and smoking aircraft, that was probably a dumb thing to do. But they got everybody out.
Yeah. How many lives did he save right there?
Oh, yeah.
One yard was killed.
Right, because that yard was standing next to Gene McCarley on the LZ as people are loading up. There's gunfire, and he's standing right next to Gene, and he's killed.
Oh, he was shot in the head. He lived. There was a yard killed. It was I forget his name. They call him Che because they reminded him of Che Guevara.
Right.
Yeah, but the aircraft split open when it rolled over, and his head was crushed under the fuselage.
Wow.
Yeah.
So, that was this historic moment in time. The next day or two later, there's a party at Khartoum CCC, and everybody got together to celebrate. And from there, your involvement, how did all this begin? What led you to the Marine Corps to become an aviator?
Oh, a funny thing is, since I've written this book, I've reconnected with a bunch of people that I've never knew or hadn't heard from in 50 years or so.
Really?
As a kid growing up in Pennsylvania, Scranton, PA, I was just a local hoodlum, ADD kid, didn't make great grades or anything. I'm on the street corner shooting hoops. We had a basketball goal we put on the light pole, and this kid comes walking by who was in the neighborhood, and he was a couple years older than me, and he's in a Marine uniform, and his name's Pete Lipo, and he's telling me about flight school, and says, describing an instrument approach. You're under this hood, and you're flying on instruments. Then the instructor says, pop the hood. You pop it back, and there's the runway right in front of you. And I said, this is the greatest thing you can do with your clothes on. I mean, this is amazing. That's what I want to do. So I'm a senior in high school. Next week, I went down to the Marine recruiter and offered myself up to be a pilot, and the guy laughed and said, son, you got to go to college to be a pilot. So they had a 2-year program called the MARCAD, Marine Cadet Program. That's what Pete was in.
Yeah.
So I said, okay, put me in, coach. I don't smoke,
Yeah.
And eventually they did away with that, and I ended up having to graduate from college, ended up in Pensacola, went to flight school. And at the same time, there was such a demand for rotor heads at the time that we were sending tons of people to the Army, and fixed-wing people were sending to the Air Force. They were so overloaded. The demand was such for pilots.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So we had, of our squadron, we had a bunch of people were Army trained, and others were Marine trained.
Any major differences between? Did you ever compare
Yeah.
I did this or you did that or?
Actually, upon graduation, an Army trained rotor head is a much more experienced helicopter pilot because we started in a T-34, an airplane. Then you graduate to the T-38. To be a, quote, naval aviator, you had to hit the boat. You had to land on an aircraft carrier.
Whoa, right.
To earn your wings of
Sure.
gold and all that. So I was in flight school for a year, and 9 months of it was in fixed wing. Then the last 3 months, they say, okay, now you transition to helicopters. Well, of course, you've just landed on an aircraft carrier. You got an ego the size of Montana.
Oh,
I'm the greatest thing since sliced bread. And they put you in this helicopter, and it's like, a monkey with a football. Like you're trying to balance yourself on a football while not spill your beer or something. It's holy mackerel. It just deflates your ego in a heartbeat. But you pick it up. But as far as by the time you get your wings, I'd say the average Army pilot, I think, had 260, 275 helicopter hours. And
allow me to go back to your
we
book
hardly
here,
had any.
because you captured this so well. You're now starting your first introduction to the helicopter training. I discovered the helicopter was a different beast, and in about a nanosecond, my ego was deflated as I tried to hover. 1,000 bolts and nuts moving in close formation. At first, it felt like trying to balance, like you said, blindfolded on one foot on the tip of a football without spilling your beer. And I couldn't help but think that the 9 months I'd spent learning to fly airplanes amounted to absolutely nothing. Zip, zilch, nada. Oh my! That's a humbling moment in time, though.
Yeah. Oh. But back to your question on the other side.
Sure.
Army trained pilots got much more helicopter time, but they're not instrument rated. They got like a tactical instrument card in case you happen to fly into a cloud, you could get yourself out. Where we were fully instrument rated, and flew instrument approaches and did all that. So probably the naval aviator might be a better aviator, and the Army graduate is a better helicopter pilot. So I give both sides a little kudo.
Indeed.
Yeah.
So you go through the training. There's several different levels. You finally wind up. You get shipped to Vietnam, and you end up with Scarface, HML heavy medium light helicopter 367.
Yeah, HML, it's light. Because originally, when you were up at Fubai, they were flying Hueys.
They were.
HML is light, HMM is medium, the CH-46. HMH is heavy, the CH-53.
Okay, very good.
So they got Cobras, but it was still HML at the time. It eventually became HMA for attack, but HML. But I was a MOS designated Huey pilot because after flight school went to New River, North Carolina to a Huey squadron.
Right.
My buddy Joe Driscoll also went there. We ended up checking.
Well, that's trouble.
Yeah, we were big in flight school, but we end up checking in Vietnam. We go to the MAG CO's office for the welcome aboard, and this colonel says, "How you doing?" and all that, and then he says, Driscoll, that name rings a bell. Well, Joe's father had flown Corsairs in the Pacific in World War II.
Really?
Yeah. And this guy says, I think I've heard of your father. Was he a Marine pilot? And he says, yeah, he flew Corsairs in the Pacific. And
no.
Colonel says, well, where do you guys want to go? And Joe says, the Cobra Squadron. He says, well, okay. Well, it wasn't as strange as it sounds because a Cobra is 80% Huey. They just took the fuselage and squished it in a vise and made tandem seating. Same engine, same rotors, same tail rotors, same skid system.
And the early models, the same underpowered engines.
Underpowered dogs, yes. But there's a lot of similarity. And this was the only Cobra squadron in the Marine Corps at the time. So there was no training group to go to.
Right.
So that's why I said in the squadron, most of them, we had Army trained guys, but most of the pilots were on the job training. It was OJT. And they had just lost some pilots, and they happened to need pilots. So when Joe says, we'd like to go to Cobras, Colonel says, okay, sure, and we go to the Cobra Squadron.
Well, I wish I had a better memory to give you a name. But when we were at CCN, when Scarface got their first Cobras, one of them, we had a couple land at CCN headquarters in Da Nang.
Mm-hmm.
And we were socked in. So one of the Cobra pilot goes, hey, Tilt, you want to come out with me? We'll go out and see if we can find some side pans to blow up. So I jumped in the front seat.
Oh, did
I
you
got
really?
my Cobra airtime.
Oh, right. Yeah, way to go.
So I can't remember the pilot's name.
It wasn't,
but this is
it wasn't Scotty or Romero, was it? They were kind of...
You know what? The only names I remember was the OIC at that time, which was a Lieutenant Colonel Robertson,
Okay.
who died in Thailand in a crash, tragically. And I knew him from '68 when they were flying the old Echo models of the Huey. So I just forget because these guys would come and go, but they knew me, and I recognized a couple of these guys. Said, "Hey, you want to go out and get some side pans?" I mean, that was the cool, literally cool, because you had the air conditioning on.
Yeah.
Everybody else was sweating their balls off.
Yeah.
And we're out there floating around.
Air conditioned seat. It's a mesh seat, and the air would flow up. It was.
Of course, right then I realized I had the wrong MOS.
Yeah.
I just love flying helicopters, but it's a different world. But that was a cool. I'm sorry. I have
I'll tell you an aside. You can cut this if you want. But in flight school, there was a Navy pilot named Ben Franklin that Joe and I went through flight school with. Uh-huh. And Ben Franklin got this pay raise because he was like an 01 over 3 years or something. Turns out he went to LSU, signed up for Army, ROTC. He went to see the movie The Blue Max. And he saw World War I biplanes, and he sees these guys up in the air, and he sees these grunts down in the mud in the trenches, and he said, I want to do that. So he calls his senator's office and asks for an inter-service transfer. He graduates, gets commissioned in the Army, asks for an inter-service transfer. So for 18 months, he's sitting at the frat house at LSU. No. And got transferred to the Navy, and he ends up in our flight school class. But it's the same thing. He said he saw the movie The Blue Max and says, "I want to do that."
Yeah, I saw the movie Blue Max, but I wasn't smart enough to get an MOS swap.
He just went for, "I want to transfer services."
Oh wow! So now you're assigned to Scarface, and so your call sign was Scarface 20. And Joe became Scarface 43. But if you could talk just for a moment about the Scarface history. I mean, you've got a rich history that we seldom hear about. And that's why I'm glad you're on for this interview, because you're in Scarface with this history and your time on that historic mission.
Yeah, well, Scarface, and it went back to World War II before they got helicopters, but it was a gunship unit, and they were up in Fubai where you were before you came to Da Nang. Sure. So it was Scarface guns flying the old Huey UH-1E gunships. Then they got relocated when they got the Cobras, relocated down to Marble Mountain. But once we got to Marble Mountain, we didn't do a lot of SOG stuff. We used to do some radio relay resupply across the border where you'd go sterile and stuff. But by by 1970, things were starting to wind down, and most of our missions were covering the Marine grunts, close-in fire support, escorting transport ships or medevac missions, which night medevacs could get a little hairy.
So when did you learn about Mission 72 now?
Well, Mission 72 was when we were going across the fence. So
right.
We did that a few times, but it was just across the border a bit, and usually it was a resupply. There was a radio relay site on a mountaintop out there.
Right.
And we'd go 46s, escort them in, and they'd bring in some supplies for them, and most of it. For all those SOG teams, that was mostly Huey gunships. That probably you were 69, right?
Right, yes, sir.
Yeah, so they were mostly
68, 69.
Yeah, they were Huey gunships then.
Oh yeah, they could barely get off the ground.
Yeah, they
always came.
They were always Huey gunships.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And then your book goes into some of the history too about SOG. You learn about Mission 72, which you said, and then your book goes through, and people just got to get it because you do a good job of coming back through the history of the war, getting the Scarface, and then you talked a little bit about what SOG was. Officially, there were no Americans on the ground in Laos or Cambodia, just as they were officially no NVA. So certain procedures were deemed necessary by some geniuses at a puzzle palace high above my pay grade. First, we had to be sterile, meaning we carried nothing that would identify us as Americans. No name tags, no dog tags, no wallets, no picture of wives or girlfriends, no letters from home. I suppose this was to provide plausible deniability for the crew if a bird was shot down. But then, again, your writing style, you come back and state the obvious. The whole idea of plausible deniability was kind of hard for me to wrap my brain around. So here I was, a 6-foot, round-eye, white guy wearing a flight suit, strapped in a green machine with Marines painted in English on the tail. Even if I could speak Lao or Vietnamese, what was I supposed to say if the bad guys got me? Hi there, I'm a Laotian woodcutter, and I've lost my way. Could you please give me some food and water and point me to Viet Tien? I like your assessment of the...
Yeah, it didn't seem to make much sense to me.
Well, and of course it did to anybody with common sense.
Yeah.
So at some point, you all get out. So talk about how you wrapped up your career, and then we'll get to the dark side of the story.
Well, I came back to the States, and the Marine Corps was going from something like 320,000 to 190,000, a RIF. So
right,
they were
reduction
in force.
Yeah.
So I get out, went to graduate school at the University of Georgia. That's how I ended up in the South, and then was going to go work for the DEA. And at the last minute, I get a call from an old squadron mate that the Shaw had just bought a bunch of J-model Cobras, and they were contacting every Marine pilot that had gotten out. I ended up going to Iran to be a flight instructor with the Iranian Army. Coming back from that, I had various sundry jobs, got fixed-wing ratings, and ended up as a commercial airline pilot with a kind of checkered past, flying freight, and then I went to Eastern, and took me 4 years to run them out of business. Then I went to Pan Am. It took me 2 years to run them out of business.
No.
Then I started over once again at United, and when they filed bankruptcy, everybody was blaming me, but it really wasn't my fault.
Wow, you're the dark man on the horizon.
Yeah, but the thing is, well, you want me to get in the genesis of the book? Or
absolutely.
Okay, 1998. This was a top secret mission, Tailwind was, but somehow CNN got a hold of it and made a documentary, and in the documentary accused us of war crimes, specifically using nerve gas to kill women and children and American defectors.
Of course, always we kill women and children.
Oh yeah. So anyhow, the good that came out of that is that one, DOD investigated and declassified everything. So that's why I was able to get all these documents, and other researchers were. And it highlighted what Mike Rose had done, and he ended up getting the Medal of Honor. So in 17...
Well, and just for a quick sidebar there, when Mike received the Medal of Honor from President Donald J. Trump, October 23rd, 2017, all you, Joe, Civil Aviators, Captain McCarley, Bernie Bright, so many other heroes from that day were there.
Got to go to the White House.
Got to go to the White House. Were there for the medal, and then also spent some time alone with the president.
Yeah, we spent about 20 minutes with them, and all the battle buddies, and
indeed,
the president and vice president were there.
Wow, is that right?
Yeah. So that's when I decided, I say I'm going to write a book about this, and I thought I could do it, as I said, in 2 years, and it took me 5.
But I took you off the rail of your trail there, but I had to mention the fact that you all were there for that moment in time.
Yeah.
And so that show comes out with the Communist News Network and Time Warner, and then the shit hit the fan. DOD investigated it. There were so many different responses to it back when there was still some critical media out there that honestly approached stories where today this
Right.
would be ignored. And they would be, the Communist News Network would probably be applauded by everybody except for maybe a couple of small media outlets. But that day, there was still real journalism available, and the courts were a true court that litigated. So take it from there a little bit further, please.
Well, it came out in, I think it was June 7th. It was the broadcast. It was called Valley of Death. It was picked up by the wire service that night, and they put a thing on the wire, AP did, that CNN has a broadcast accusing the Americans of using nerve gas in Laos, a weapon of mass destruction. It was picked up by the French wire service and the Chinese wire service, and by the next morning, it had gone around the world. Of course, that's when we're accusing Saddam Hussein of using weapons of mass destruction, and he comes out, and the Russians come out and say, look you did it in Laos in 1970.
Sure.
So it became a big brouhaha. CNN rebroadcast it the next Sunday with additional footage. They doubled down and said, yeah, here's our proof. Well, as you said, mainstream media picked up on it, from TV Guide to Newsweek to the Wall Street to New York Times. They said, this doesn't pass the smell test. It just doesn't sound right, and raised the red flag. And within 4 weeks or so, CNN hired an attorney named Floyd Abrams, a First Amendment attorney,
It was the New York Times.
New York
litigator.
attorney, litigator, and hired him to do an investigation, and he did an investigation for CNN. DOD did an investigation, other news sources investigated it, and came out and said, you shouldn't have aired it. You made a mistake, CNN ended up retracting it. They apologized, kind of, sort of. They said, we shouldn't have run the story. We didn't have the proof. They never said it didn't happen, but they kind of said, we shouldn't have run the story, which is, it's an apology of sorts. But, they got a black eye of it, and it's the way the thing was structured. CNN was the go-to network for emergencies, for natural disasters, wars, whatever. When something catastrophic happened, everybody tuned in.
They were a respected news network then.
They were. Ted Turner was a visionary, and that was hardcore news. But for weekday entertaining, when CBS, NBC, and ABC are running sitcoms, nobody tuned in CNN unless there's a hurricane or a war or something. So they hired a guy named Rick Kaplan from ABC to be president of CNN USA, to bring some pizzazz to the network. And they wanted to build upon this news show they had called Well, they came up with CNN and Time.
They wanted to compete with 60 Minutes.
They wanted to compete with 60 Minutes, ABC, all of their news shows. So they brought Kaplan in, and he started this special investigative unit, and a lady named Pam Hill was put in charge of it. Well, the year before, another one of their documentaries shows had done something based on John Plaster's book about SOG warriors. And it didn't get any traction, didn't make it anywhere. But in John Plaster's book, he has a few pages about Tailwind.
Right.
So they assigned this to
Which actually reported that they used CS.
Yeah, did. But April Oliver, who worked on that, became the producer for this newsstand show. It was CNN and Time, newsstand, CNN and Time, they called it. So she latched on to Tailwind, said, well, we'll do our inaugural show on Tailwind. And she started calling her sources here and sources there. And she went down some rabbit holes and latched on to things. And it's kind of confirmation bias. You have this opinion, and you just want to listen to people that are going to verify what you believe. Pam Hill, who runs the investigative unit, says keep everything close to the vest in-house, so she couldn't reach out to Jamie McIntyre, their Pentagon reporter, or Perry Smith, the retired Air Force general, who was their military
Who at
advisor.
that point he really was
Yeah.
responsible for making CNN so responsive and
Yeah.
respected.
Yeah,
because
respected.
he had the connections that he could go to any kind of an action, military-wise.
Right.
Say, I'm with CNN, we're going to do this, and they were, at that point,
They were
respected.
well respected.
Sure.
And then the whole thing's headed by Kaplan, who's bringing pizzazz to the network and kind of plays loose and fast with the rules. So April Oliver, the two tenets of her show were nerve gas and defectors. So for nerve gas, she's having dinner with her cameraman, a guy named Mike Marriott, who had spent 8 years working for CBS in Vietnam, was an experienced Vietnam guy, left on the last bird out in April of 75 on the evac. Marriott tells her this story that he went for a ride in the back of a Navy F-4 in 1971 over North Vietnam, and that the CIA briefed him about this special gas that they had called glink. And if you get shot down, we're going to come in and gas the whole area. You'll be unconscious, but the paramedics will come in. They'll inject you with the antidote, extract you, and everybody else will die. Glink. Well, she buys into that. That plants the bug in her head. Regardless of the fact there was no bombing of North Vietnam from 1968 to 1972.
Right.
He said he went on this. He was from Australia. So what's the odds of a CIA briefing a foreign national on a top secret program that didn't exist? And then when it came to court, they got access to his computer and saw that he had researched nerve gas and CBUs and other things like the week before he had dinner with April Oliver. No. So that plants the nerve gas in her hair. And then Van Buskirk, who was Lieutenant Van Buskirk, led the 1st platoon, and a heroic guy, did great things on Tailwind, but he kind of sometimes had problems telling the truth.
He had some memory issues 28 years later.
Well, yeah, after he left SOG, he got wounded and got medevac to the States and then got orders to Germany. He gets to Germany and he starts, comes up, not sure if he wants to stay in the Army. He comes up with this, he gets into fast cars, goes to driving school, and he has this racing habit. So he's selling antique clocks and other stuff on the side. He said he was making $4,000 to $5,000 a month above his Army salary selling stuff on the side to support his racing habit. Ends up, he gets arrested and thrown in a German prison. He's in prison, and they accuse him of selling guns. He's in prison, and he has a come to Jesus moment, and he's saved, and he ends up. They don't charge him. He is born again. He comes back to the U.S. and goes to divinity school at Duke. And he makes his shtick is prison ministries because he can relate to prisoners. But he always had this penchant for fast cars and women and money. And preachers don't make a lot of money, but he ends up, he married a girl from Georgia.
I don't want to go too far down that road.
Okay. But
he said things that
he said used. Things. He was interviewed, and he said, first, he wrote a book called Tailwind, and he said he had killed an NVA regimental commander. Then on his first interviews with April Oliver, he said, I killed a Russian advisor. And then after several interviews, he says, no, it was Americans. He said there were 2 Americans, blonde hair, right off the beach in California. They ran down and went into a spider hole, and I yelled in the spider hole, I'm Lieutenant Van Buskirk, I'm here to take you home. And they said, F you, and he said, F you, and threw a Willie Pete in there. That was his story. So there was the reason to use nerve gas in April Oliver's head. That gave her, why use nerve gas? Well, it's to kill these American defectors. And the story went on from there, and she got people on the show who were not even in SOG, who were never set foot in Laos, testifying, and it fell apart. It fell apart under scrutiny. It was a sad day for journalism.
Absolutely. So through all this, you were supportive of it, working with people. We had Jim Moriarty at that time. Worked with several of the men from Operation Tailwind, and did over $1 million worth of billable time that he could have billed people for, that he donated to help those SF
Yeah,
men.
he did. And he was making this documentary, which he wanted to go to trial with CNN.
Yeah.
And instead of money, he wanted them to show this documentary. But everything was settled out of
Yeah,
court.
many settlements out of court, all of which were sealed,
Yeah.
and no further details provided. None were asked for, and that's where we ended up. And of course, Gene McCarley had said too that he had a conversation with Ted Turner,
He did.
and Ted Turner finally wrote a letter of apology to Gene, said that he would write him to the other members of Tailwind. Never did.
Never did.
And that's just part of that whole disgraceful legacy. And of course, today, the curse of the internet, you can still find that story that was aired by the Communist News Network.
Yeah.
That talks about the Valley of Death.
Yeah.
And there's a couple of podcasters now that pick this up, and they run with the stories. And one in particular does a positive light, and he uses that to talk about the valor, but he's taking footage from the Valley of Death
Oh,
and uses it. It's
I
just
didn't know that. Yeah.
Yeah, well, that's part of today's society here with all that, the different things we have to live with are complicated, media infested.
Yeah.
And now with the media changing to what it was today compared to 20 years ago.
You know, they say for centuries, news generally flowed from somewhat verifiable sources at the top down to the people. And now with the internet and cell phones, news comes from 1 billion people typing with their thumbs from the bottom, unverifiable, and you can say anything. You can just say anything, and someone's going to believe it. You can say the moon's made of green cheese, and somebody's going to believe it.
Yeah, and there were many descriptions that came out with that. In the American Journalism Review, which was a magazine that focused on journalism, newspapers, and they wrote that Valley of Death could appear on CNN, and in time, despite its flaws, should not be dismissed as an aberration, but seen as a biopsy from a system that suffers from a serious pathology, says Ted Gupp, G-U-P, a former investigative reporter for Time, who is now writing books and teaching journalism at Georgetown University. The controversy, he says, represents most immensely of all with the media at large a very disturbing trend of senior editors becoming increasingly more gullible, and a tendency for more and more journalists to work in the realm of possibility rather than truth. You don't print possibilities when they can destroy individual and national reputations, he says. The stakes are too high. And that is a perfect indictment of the Communist News Network and Time Warner.
But, you know, in the media today, if it bleeds, it leads, is the buzzword. People tune in to see something exciting, you know, the car chase, the fire, whatever, and they have the clicker in their hand, and if you don't get their attention and keep their attention, they'll change channels, and that's advertising dollars. So it's all about money.
Yeah, it is. There was another aspect, just a quick sidebar here as I try to get my act together. We had, you listed some of the awards and decorations that were presented, but you also had information about the helicopters to talk about the support. You said that there were about 12,000 helicopters used in the Second Indochina War, which is our Vietnam War, of which more than 5,600 were destroyed. During that time, 4,877 American pilots and crew members lost their lives. Included in these totals were approximately 200 helicopters plus 177 pilots and crew members killed in the secret war in Laos. And that information you posted was from the Vietnam Helicopter Pilots Association. And he said it reflects only on classified losses. Then early losses across the fence were classified and not all records were updated. So the numbers are probably understated. And the one other number that we have to add to that today we still have 1,581 Americans from the Vietnam War in Southeast Asia that are still listed as MIA. Out of that, we have 50 Green Berets alone that were lost in the secret war that are still missing in action.
Yeah.
And we're going to have, in a future SOGcast, we'll be interviewing one of the brothers of one of our SF MIAs to talk about that side of that coin. So we're at that point in time here. Any other little thoughts or things you would like to point out for the SOGcast, one way or the other?
Well, when you just said that, it brought something to mind. Talking to a fella that works at the agency in Hawaii where they go out to relocate bodies.
DPAA.
DPAA.
Yes, the Department of Defense, Department of POW, MIA, Accounting Ability Agency.
Talking to someone there in my research, as I said, all the records for the 559th were destroyed. But, and this is kind of interesting, there was someone who kept a record of all the American aircraft shot down on a piece of paper.
Really?
And they have it somewhere.
DPAA.
Yeah, but this fellow, not Doug Matt, I can't think of his name, but anyhow, he was looking for it. He said, I've seen it. It's written somewhere because I was trying to find out who shot down each of the helicopters lost on Tailwind. That would have been a nice tidbit. He'd list down who shot it down, who got credit for it.
Really?
But yeah. But anyhow, this piece of paper, this guy that I talked to has had seen it, and then COVID hit, so they worked from home for 2 years, and then they were back to the office, and they're renovating, so they took out all the file cabinets, and they're redoing this office or something. So it's been like a 3-year search. I've been communicating with this guy. Maybe someday I'll find that. I think, it'll be a footnote in history, but I think it'll be a neat piece of trivia.
Well, yeah, because the Russians and the Russians, as you point out in your book, more than 3,000 Russians served in their secret war in Vietnam. A lot were cannon cockers and radar people training up, as well as the anti-aircraft, which is cannon cockers, anti-aircraft.
Yeah, same.
And so, any other last thoughts there as we close up here?
No, nothing. I appreciate your time.
Well, likewise. And then we just as a footnote to all this, the Special Operations Association was formed in 1976 by Green Berets that fought in the secret war. And we have some SEALs, a couple of key Marine Corps folks that came in. They expanded the membership to include aviators that supported SOG, of which Scarface is a member. And one of the unique aspects of the war was that a team would be on the ground. We're in trouble. Aviators come, save our bacon, pull us out under enemy fire. We've lost men, great valor during that 8-year secret war. Aviators would go home, we go home, lick our wounds, gear up for the next mission. It happens again. But there's never any opportunity to have interaction between.
Yeah.
So we've had different helicopter units in there. That was cool. But we never met the SPAD pilots. So there was a reunion in Sevierville at the Tennessee Museum of Aviation, which now would be, 8 or 9 years ago.
Yeah.
And that was the first reunion. There was a second reunion. And at that reunion, several people spoke, including you, sir. And I'm going to close on that note because you had the perfect... I'm quoting from a book, SOG Chronicles, Volume 1, written by yours truly. But It was a perfect assessment.
Okay.
And so, so you close it, and I'm reading from the book, said, and then on an impromptu closing note that seemed to be apropos editorial comment on Operation Tailwind in general, laced in the vernacular of 1970, Pencek turned to the audience and apologized to ladies in advance for, quote, contaminating the spoken word with profanities to summarize the time he spent during that operation. I can't think of another way to say this, he said apologetically. For example, if somebody's really good, he's hot shit. If something was good, it was shit hot. If you got into a bad situation, it was a shit sandwich. Don Persky mentioned the sandwich we got into earlier. If you had your act together, you had your shit together. And I would like to say that I was honored to have a week or so to spend with all these people here and a bunch of others. And they were a bunch of hot shit guys on a shit hot mission, and we got into a shit sandwich, but we got our shit together in the end. No shit. Indeed, that's a classic, albeit somewhat shitty postscript to Operation Tailwind, courtesy of Barry Pencek.
You're welcome.
Oh, yes. Well, thank you. We have to. So we'll close on that note. And as always, we want to thank Jocko Productions in collaboration with SOG Chronicles for this production, for making these possible. And we always thank all the men and women in our armed services who have fought and bled for this country. We also thank Border Patrol, law enforcement, first responders, EMTs, corrections officers, people putting their lives on the line during these 2 years with COVID, the hospital personnel and what they were up against. And we just thank them all for what they've done over the years and continue to do is to serve our country. And we thank the men and women who served the years past, heroes like you, sir, Barry Pencek. We thank you for that service, your time in the Marine Corps with aviation, that we can never lose the sight of how great that history is, and you're a part of that lineage. We also remember and salute the men and women from the Vietnam War who did not return. Today there are 1,581 missing in action, including our 50 Green Berets, and as Barry said, over 100 plus aviators. Depending on who you talk to, we've documented 83. But we thank those men and women, and we salute that memory. God bless America. Until next time.